Good evening, everybody. So brilliant to see so many of you here this evening. A really, really warm welcome to you all. My name is Professor Sarah Barrow, and I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Arts and Humanities here at UEA. Thank you all so much for joining us for our third inaugural lecture of the spring term. It's great to be here in person this evening, but also welcome to those of you joining us here in the Julian Studies Centre and those of you joining via YouTube. So we're really aware that there are some people dialing in from quite some way away, early in the morning, and you are extremely welcome. Thank you for taking part wherever you are in the world, and please let us know in the chat where you're watching from. Of course, my main job is to welcome our speaker for this evening, Professor Joanne Clarke. Jo Clarke joined UEA in 2001. Her research interests include societal responses to climatic changes during the early and mid-Holocene in the Near East and North Africa, and the impacts of future climate change on heritage in Africa. She's directed archaeological field projects in Gaza, Cyprus, and most recently, Western Sahara, culminating in a book project published in 2018. Joanne was PI for an AHRC-funded project, a network in 2011, Environmental Change in Prehistory, which resulted in a paper in Quaternary Science Reviews contextualizing linked archaeological and environmental narratives in current thinking around resilience, vulnerability, and adaptation to rapid climate change. I think you're probably already getting the kind of the view that she's very adaptable and interdisciplinary in her approaches, which is just brilliant and very UEA. She's also been co-I on a number of climate-related research projects, most recently with Professor Corinne Lequerre on the Tyndall Centre's GCRF-funded bid, Foundations for Climate Resilient and Sustainable Growing Settlements. Jo is currently working with a team of international scholars modelling the impacts of sea level rise and coastal erosion on African coastal heritage. Recently, she co-authored a paper for Azania, Archaeological Research in Africa, on the impacts of climate change on African heritage now and into the future. This paper has seen considerable media interest. Jo is a contributing author to the heritage section of the Africa chapter of the 6th assessment report for the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. I'd like to hand over to her colleague Simon Dell, who's going to say a few words, but I'd just like to end my little piece by saying how proud we are of Jo and all her work, and wishing her well for her wonderful talk this evening. Thank you, and over to Simon.
Thank you. I've been told to be brief, and I've been told I need to mention snails. So I've worked alongside Jo for all the 21 years that she's been here in, first of all, what was the School of World Art Studies and Art History, and now the department. And I did just want to say just a very little about that. The first thing to say, what that means is that the majority of Jo's career has been spent working in a humanities context. Archaeology, as you all know, is interestingly a discipline which you can study either in a humanities context or a science one for a BA or a BSc. And you might have thought that the amount of time that Jo's had to spend perforce with people like me, an art historian, would have led her towards a humanities path. But I think what's really striking about Jo's work is its breadth, which is really beyond something somebody with my background can properly comprehend. It's not just that she's worked in different places, in different capacities, in Jerusalem and Cyprus and Northwest Africa. It's also that she's asked very different kinds of questions about the status of portraiture and the representation of the human body, but also about insularity and identity, and as we've heard most recently, about the science of climate change. So she has a real kind of diversity. She also has a long treasured project to write a book about troglodytes, and as I mentioned, she likes snails, I think for research purposes. So a distinctive research interest is different creatures that live under rocks. But that's only one aspect of her research, and what should be emphasised is its breadth, which is really distinctive, and it's great to see that properly recognised. I just want to say a few more things very quickly. The first is that Jo hasn't been somebody who's prioritised her research career, and that's been at the cost of her teaching and her pastoral duties. I know some of her students are here. She's deeply committed to her teaching and to cheering the students on over the finishing line, and if need be, dragging them over that finishing line by the hair. That has happened. And it's also worth saying that Jo's done all of this as a single parent. And that's an achievement. It's, you know, that's not always been easy. And it's great to see Anna here today as Jo's daughter, as guest of honour. So it's been an achievement, and it's got to be said it's also an achievement because UEA is not always the most supportive of environments. Male professors here still outnumber women of a proportion of almost 2 to 1. In fact, I think the exact figures are 110 women and 202 men. And that really isn't good enough. So Jo's achievement is something to celebrate, the fact that we now have 111. And that's a very, very good thing. And what we're here to do is indeed to celebrate her achievement. So please join me now in welcoming Jo to deliver her inaugural.
So I've pressed this button and now I'm live, so you can't do anything for the next 45 minutes. Thank you very much, Sarah and Simon, for such a lovely welcome. In a week's time exactly, I will have been here 21 years. And so I've seen a lot of changes and development, some great, some not so great. But one of the things is that Simon is completely right. You would think that 21 years working in a history of art department, you'd be seeing a lot more art in this presentation tonight, and you're not. But equally, I do teach ancient art and archaeology, so yeah, so I have a broad range of interests. So I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and I'm delighted to see such an must be end of COVID, everyone wants to come out. But it's just lovely to see you all, and I know there are a lot of people who are online. So to all my friends and colleagues in various countries around the world, welcome to my inaugural lecture. So I won't say more than that. I think I'll probably get on with the lecture. And there's two things that I would like to do tonight. The first is I want to demonstrate, using concrete examples, how archaeology provides useful and relevant legacies for climate change resilience and adaptation today. The other thing I would like to do, so just two things, is show how archaeology and heritage are gaining traction in climate change and sustainable development policy agendas and literature. So, just to start with something that the climate scientists in the room will recognize. A paper by Kaufman et al. In 2020 in Nature presented a new multi-proxy database of paleotemperature time series for the last 12,000 years, modeling global mean surface temperature. They use 5 different statistical methods in their reconstructions. Leaving out the specifics of the climate modeling behind the graph, you can see that the warmest 200-year-long interval happened around 6,500 years ago, after which GMST cooled, global mean surface temperature. Although the authors admit that there is currently no accepted best approach to reconstructing GMST, the graph is illustrative of the fact that the cooling trend has been reversed since the industrial age, and that its reversal has scaled up a pace, so that we are now back to the temperatures of 6,500 years ago, and we have achieved that in the space of little more than 70 years. 700 years would be pretty good. We are now approaching the 12,000-year maximum of global mean surface temperatures, which occurred 6,500 years ago. Given archaeologists study human societies that lived 6,500 years ago, the graph suggests that we are well placed to inform on future climate change outcomes, as we can look back to 6,500 years ago and see how people lived in a warmer climate. Understandably, climate scientists would also look at the graph and say, well, today we are facing an unprecedented uptick in global warming, and that it is not about living in a warmer climate, it is about adapting to a rapidly changing climate. However, archaeologists have more at their disposal than simply knowing how people lived in a warmer climate. We also have evidence via regional and local climatic proxy data of how societies adapted to what paleoclimatologists term rapid climate change events in the past in some regions of the world. Take the Eastern Mediterranean, for example. Using a combination of lake sediment cores, deep sea sediment records, oxygen and carbon isotopes from stalagmites, tree ring records, and globally also the Greenland Ice Sheet Project 2 ice core, climate scientists have been able to reconstruct regional temperature, rainfall, and vegetation over many thousands of years. The more recent the proxy record, the better and more fine-grained the data, and the better able archaeologists are to correlate these rapid climate events with societal changes that we see in the archaeological record. It's not an exact science, but with care and attention to detail, the robustness of resolution and nuance that archaeologists are able to garner from these two lines of evidence has improved significantly in the last 20 years. So, by way of example, the figure in this slide is from a 2019 paper by Elko Rowling and colleagues, and shows a number of climatic proxy records for the Eastern Mediterranean, some of which I've just showed in the previous map. The widespread Holocene rapid climate change events described by Majewski et al. In 2004 are indicated with violet-shaded horizontal bars. On the right-hand side, here, are the well-defined Aegean sea surface temperature trends and the high frequency, on the farthest right, the high frequency component of variability in the Gita Cave Delta 18 oxygen speleothem, stalagmite, for those of you who don't know what a speleothem is, record. So Rowling et al. Interpret their results as rapid climate change events being periods of highly variable conditions with an overall tendency toward cold and wet conditions with potential for flash flooding. The point I want to make here, without simplifying the climate data too much, is that the period between 6,000 and 5,000 years ago, which is here, is commonly regarded as a period of extreme climatic variability, as shown by the rapid shift from blue humid to red arid conditions. And you can see the difference between this period between 6,000 and 5,000 years ago and these kind of clumped periods of humid. This is the Gita Cave speleothem record. So what this variability meant for people living through it and how it might help us to think about increasing variability in our own climate in the future is the purview of archaeologists. Yet we're not routinely asked how societies may have become resilient to a rapidly changing climate in the past, not by climate scientists, not by policymakers, and heritage, fundamental to social memory, identity, and even societal well-being, is only mentioned twice in the UN's 2017 Sustainable Development Goals, and then only tangentially. As you may expect, archaeologists are grumbling about this. Michael Smith, in a recent paper in Antiquity, on the left-hand side of your screen, laments that archaeologists are having little impact on other scholarly disciplines and stakeholders or policymakers. In fact, he doesn't miss the irony that his grumblings were made in a journal aimed at and read by archaeologists, thus preaching to the converted. His assessment: the main hurdle is that we have not produced rigorous quantitative data that can be understood and analyzed by scientists working in the relevant domains. Effectively, he argues that climate scientists not only see little relevance of archaeology to their own discipline, but neither do governments and international organizations concerned with bringing about successful adaptation to a changing climate. And this, I would argue, is not because our discipline lacks quantitative data, but that we are not speaking or writing in ways that draw attention to archaeological research. Michael Smith points out that nobody working in climate-resilient cities, working on climate-resilient cities, cares what archaeologists might think about the possible relevance of their research. But if a sociologist were to interact with archaeologists and learn a little bit about ancient resilient cities, then he or she may decide that archaeological findings do have relevance to some domain of knowledge on modern cities. If so, they might cite the relevant archaeological publications and use archaeological results in their own research. But only they can judge the relevance, not the archaeologists working on ancient cities. Michael Smith is not the only archaeologist to bemoan the lack of interest amongst climate scientists in the relevance of legacies from the past to inform a more climate-resilient future. A recent paper by Burke in 2021 on the right-hand side, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, noted that archaeology has great potential to offer alternatives to solutions proposed from within the Western agro-industrial complex, because archaeology of climate change provides opportunities to identify the factors that promoted human resilience in the past and apply the knowledge gained to the present, contributing a much-needed long-term perspective to climate research. End of a very long quote. Other archaeologists have been more direct, criticizing the lack of engagement in both climate change scholarship and climate change policy with how the past might be useful for thinking around some of the issues we will face as we move forward into a different climate future. Boivin and Crowther, for example, write in Nature, Ecology and Evolution about key ways that historical data can enhance the resilience of societies today and into the future. In their diagram, they suggest that disciplines like archaeology, history, historical ecology, and paleoecology can play a role in shaping sustainable solutions to the challenges facing society, and they list 10 challenges that archaeology and related disciplines can play a key role in tackling. So I want to pick up on two of these by way of illustration. And the first is enhanced food security. So this quite complex map shows the continent of Africa at about 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, as modeled by Larasuana, Roberts, and Rowling in 2013. At this time, the Sahara was largely vegetated. Known as the African Humid Period, there are a number of large lakes across the area that is now the Sahara Desert. And these lakes and surrounding vegetation supported a variety of animals that today require at best savanna conditions, including giraffe, shown here on a rock outcrop in the very arid desert of southern Libya, but also hippopotamus and a wide range of other species. But sometime after 6,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert began to grow, due in part to a southerly shift of the African monsoon, which was itself in part due to the final reorganization of the world's climate to its current conditions. This took some thousands of years, by the way, just to make that clear. Recently, I worked with colleagues in Africa, the United States and the UK on researching African heritage in a changing climate. Abundant archaeological evidence indicates that pastoralism originated and evolved as a response to increasingly marginal and variable climatic conditions as North Africa transitioned to aridity. Saharan pastoralism evolved over many millennia, but waves of pastoral expansion coincided with periods of rapid climatic change. African pastoralism is thus fundamentally rooted in adaptation to profound climatic shifts of a kind likely to be experienced in many African regions as climate change accelerates over the course of the 21st century and beyond. While the current emphasis is on transitions from herding to farming, this process might be reversed in some locations where climate change is likely to make crop farming unviable. In these contexts, mobile pastoralism may represent a more appropriate economic strategy under new climatic and environmental conditions. While pastoral systems have developed to be resilient and adaptable in the face of climate variability and uncertainty, they are challenged by absolute limits to pastoral adaptation. Very severe and protracted droughts, such as those being experienced in Mauritania as recently as October 2021 and reported by the BBC, can result in extended migration, the breakdown of social relations, a reconfiguration of identities around new activities, and disruption to social and political institutions, resulting in a collapse of adaptive strategies. The preservation of a pastoralist heritage requires that pastoralist identities, knowledge systems, and livelihoods are recognized, valued, and supported. Narratives of pastoralists as highly vulnerable to climate change need to be challenged, and the resilience and adaptive capacity inherent in pastoral systems recognized. Preserving pastoral heritage requires policies that enable pastoralism to continue to evolve by blending traditional and novel practices and arrangements to navigate its double exposure to climate change and socioeconomic change. The integration of scientific, indigenous, and other knowledge via a process of co-production involving pastoralists and other national and international actors has the potential to improve current adaptive responses by creating opportunities for the integration of local autonomous adaptation with national adaptation plans. More intrinsically, adaptive capacity within pastoral systems can be maintained through measures such as the preservation of indigenous livestock breeds and associated genetic diversity. So with international colleagues, I have just this week published a comment piece in Nature Climate Change calling for more equitable research across the climate change heritage sector in order to address exactly these systemic inequalities, and by recognizing the breadth of heritage for strengthening adaptation action globally. Climate change is an increasing focus of heritage research across Europe and North America, including identification of site-specific adaptation options for heritage preservation. In contrast, climate change research in low and middle income countries is limited by systemic gaps in access to funding and its associated knowledge generation, which act to reinforce historical colonial structures deeply embedded in heritage management. A map in that article, shown here on this slide, shows the distribution of UNESCO World Heritage Sites by country and is illustrative of exactly the imbalance in climate change heritage research that exists for the African continent. So Michael Smith highlighted the fact that archaeology can be relevant to growing sustainable cities, the 9th category on Boivin and Crowther's diagram. Boivin and Crowther point out that more than half the Earth's 7.5 billion people currently live in cities. Yet most existing forms of urbanism are morphologically, functionally, and environmentally unsustainable under current conditions. Again, recently I worked with colleagues in development studies and the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, and Sarah mentioned it in her introduction, on the NERC-funded grant, the Natural and Environment Research Council funded grant, looking at climate change adapted, sustainable and growing settlements. One key archaeological finding of that research was that low-density, spatially diverse urbanism characterized many ancient cities, including many in Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa. A critical feature of these ancient cities is what appeared to be a more equitable social and economic structure. The practice of intensive agriculture was often within the city itself, allowing for more sustainable, food-secure model of urbanism. Boivin and Crowther point out that these diversified urban settlements serve as useful models for urban and peri-urban agriculture as a solution to present-day sustainability challenges, and in particular, the energy crisis. So one such climate-resilient city that survived for some 1,500 years was Djenné in Mali. Situated between the Niger and Bani rivers at the southern end of the navigable part of the inland Niger Delta, the town sprang up around 300 BC and was abandoned around 1250 AD in favor of the World Heritage Site Djenné, a city that exists today close to the original ancient town. The inland Niger Delta is a vast floodplain of active false deltaic hydrology. It comprises swamps, lakes, borebags, and rivers that acted as refuges for ancient peoples still fleeing the desiccation of the Sahara Desert. This is just a picture to kind of illustrate, what the inland Niger Delta sort of looked like. I mean, the picture, for those of you who are not archaeologists, this is what archaeology looks like. So sometimes it's useful to illustrate with something a bit more modern. So Djenné was a prosperous commercial center for regional trade based on a highly productive, diversified hinterland. Djenné's prosperity depended on the dual role of a critical transshipment point for long-distance trade and as a major production and exchange center for regional commerce in staples and raw materials such as rice, millet, honey, textiles, and preserved fish. Two factors were critical to Djenné's development as a city: its situation at the most southerly point of the navigable inland Niger Delta, and its extraordinarily productive agricultural hinterland. Djenné is distinct for a number of reasons. It was part of a series of urban settlements, all within a short distance of each other, with a total population on the various mounds that comprise the site of upwards of 50,000 people. These discrete settlements are described by the excavators as site clustering. Crucially, Djenné does not display many of the 10 characteristics of urban development that were put forward by the archaeologist Gordon Childe in the 1950s, and whose 10 characteristics remained unchallenged until the late 20th century. In the 1950s paper in the journal Town Planning Review, he suggested that cities are characterized by increased settlement size, concentration of wealth, large-scale public works, representational art, knowledge of science and engineering, foreign trade, full-time craft specialists and other non-subsistence-based activities, a stratified society with political organization based on residence rather than kinship, sedentism, and writing. This model became widely accepted amongst post-war historical archaeological circles, but importantly was also represented in the interpretations of new archaeological discoveries. Yet in Africa, and in other non-Western regions of the world, many cities existed without many of these 10 characteristics. At the site cluster of Djenné-Djenné, there is no evidence of a concentration of wealth or of large-scale public works. There's no evidence for writing and no evidence of hierarchy or social stratification. There's no evidence for a high priest or a king or even a cohort of elites that held sway over the settlement. Yet the Macintoshes, these are the people who excavated the site, reported that there would have been at least 27,000 people living on the main Djenné-Djenné mound alone. What Djenné-Djenné does have is beautiful representational art, knowledge of science and engineering in the form of metal production, foreign trade, as I mentioned earlier, full-time craftspeople, and a degree of sedentism based around loosely affiliated extended kinship groups. And the excavators sum up the differences between our Western perspective of what a city should look like and what they found at Djenné-Djenné. And they say, and I quote, "Many separate habitation mounds in close proximity were occupied simultaneously and together functioned as a city with a heterogeneous population that provided diverse services and manufacturers to a wider integrated hinterland. Urban clustering involved individual communities that gravitated together, but which avoided assimilation into a single entity. Djenné-Djenné was surrounded within 1 kilometer by 24 smaller satellites, all occupied simultaneously. These satellites were organized into extended household compounds that were defined by low-lying walls. The emphasis on spatial compartmentalization and specialization made it possible for each of the communities in the inland Niger Delta clusters to exploit proximity to clients and suppliers of other services without surrendering corporate identity to clients and suppliers of other services, corporate identity to a single urban identity. So clustering minimized scalar stress and allowed for the creation of a resilient economic system in an unpredictable environment. There's no geomorphological explanation for the discreteness of these sites, but surface remains suggests that spatial separation was a strategy for maintaining boundaries between specialist communities. I like to think of it a little like guilds. Clustering was equivalent to creating a resource hinterland, but inside the confines of the cluster. This lessened the strain on the environment. The greater environmental sustainability of clustered versus nucleated cities is visible in the subsistence data for Djenné-Djenné. Usually the breadth of diet declines with urbanization, but at Djenné this was not the case. Throughout occupation, the excavators report that diet remained a broad mix of farmed, herded, hunted, gathered, and fished resources. So ultimately, the social and economic structure of Djenné provided it with a level of resilience to various kinds of shocks, including climatic and environmental shocks. This resilience was based on multiple types of fluidity, which enabled rapid and smooth transformation when adaptation was required. This is very different from the fixed, immutable cities of today, in the West in particular, that have little room for transformational adaptation. Djenné-Djenné is a legacy from the past that could provide the building blocks, at least, for thinking what future resilient cities might look like. So these two examples, I think, have demonstrated quite forcefully the relevance of archaeology to climate change research and policy for today. Therefore, in my view, it is time that archaeologists stop going cap in hand to climate scientists asking to be included on their research grants or as co-authors on their papers. And recent collaborations are demonstrating that archaeologists are equal contributors to important transdisciplinary research of this kind. So a second paper that appeared last week in Nature Climate Change, for which I am proudly a contributor, but which could only have been possible with the equal contribution of people across an extraordinary range of expertise and scholarly disciplines, but which included archaeologists. Slowly, through important transdisciplinary endeavors, such as African heritage sites at threat as sea level rise accelerates, demonstrate the relevance of archaeology and archaeological approaches to heritage for climate change research. But returning to Michael Smith, in one way he is right. One of the main hurdles that I found with the sea level rise article was that quite unexpectedly, but actually probably quite predictably, we spoke different languages, we took different approaches to the same research questions, and what appeared as fundamental to the success of the research for archaeologists was not always seen as what was relevant to the non-archaeologists. For me, it also required a hockey stick curve of learning the science behind the research. For the modelers, many of them engineers, the way in which my mind worked and how, or does still work, I think, and how I problematized the research was completely alien, something that the lead author has recently reflected upon in his blog, In Nature Sustainability. Fundamentally, the difference in this research was that the work of the archaeologist was integral, not a bolt-on that appeared disconnected from the main body of the research. So what did we do then, and what were the conclusions? The aim was to accurately map the physical extent of African heritage sites using geospatial techniques and then overlay these with flood maps based on hydrodynamically modeled extreme sea level data. The result was an estimate of the extent of exposure to sea level rise and coastal erosion for African heritage sites in the future. The wider objective is to help African heritage managers identify and prioritize key areas for conservation and heritage adaptation to climate change. We included 284 natural and cultural UNESCO World Heritage Sites, World Heritage Sites on the tentative list, and Ramsar wetland sites. Combined flood and erosion models created specifically for the project were then overlaid onto the map of African heritage sites. Different future climate scenarios at different time slices were modeled for exposure of sites to flooding and erosion associated with future sea levels. We found that 56 sites along the entire coast of the African continent are currently at risk of a 1 in 100 year extreme sea level event. But by 2050, this number more than triples to 191 under a moderate carbon emission scenario. What I mean by that is under a carbon emission scenario where we actually try and take a little bit of action to do something about our present course. The number stabilizes at 2050 with only another 7 sites being exposed under a high emission scenario, which some climate scientists call business as usual. However, the degree of exposure for each site increases significantly. So what I mean by that is that although the number doesn't increase, the amount of site threatened by extreme sea levels in the future increases significantly. Among the most exposed cultural sites, and that of course is the principal concern of archaeologists, are the Roman ruins of Tipasa in Algeria, the North Sinai archaeological sites in Egypt, which were on their tentative list, and as I've shown a picture here, the Saloum Delta in Senegal. This slide shows oyster shell middens, a feature of the ancient deltaic landscape being used as sea defenses in the Saloum Delta. North and West Africa, under our modeling, have the highest number of exposed sites, and small island states are also particularly at risk. In an indirect way, archaeologists bring a unique perspective to this kind of work because many of us have spent time in country on sites like these or similar to these sites that we have recorded. For example, this image of the overtopping of sea defenses at Elima Castle in Ghana, taken by my colleague who is in the room tonight, Professor Anne Hauer, and used by our lead author, Michalis Voustoukas, in his blog in the Nature Sustainability community, is the kind of image that reflects the deep understanding and connection that archaeologists have with the countries and people that we work with, work in, and write with. Recently, archaeology and heritage have been gaining traction within climate change policy circles, including being the focus of recent international meetings, one jointly sponsored by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, that's UNESCO, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, ICOMOS, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. The purpose of this meeting was to commission 3 white papers, one on impacts, vulnerability, and understanding risks of climate change for culture and heritage, to establish a better understanding of potential climate risks to heritage globally, and due to be published in July 2022. Another recent meeting, sponsored by the British Council and the Department for Culture, Media and Sport in the UK, was Climate Culture Peace. These groundbreaking international meetings have, for the most part, been due to a sea change in the way in which archaeology and heritage scholarship are viewed within climate change and sustainable development policy circles, but also because of the hard work of some of my colleagues, and I'm going to name 2, Marcy Rockman and Hannah Morell, who have always understood the importance of archaeology and heritage for climate research and policy. On another level, I would argue that it is also because climate scientists increasingly recognize the importance of the mobilization of a variety of expertise across science, social science, the humanities, and also non-academics if we are to achieve a sustainable climate-changed future. One of the conclusions of the white paper on impacts, vulnerability, and understanding risks of climate change for culture and heritage was that heritage is integral to every one of the IPCC sectoral chapters. And this slide shows the sectoral chapters for the IPCC's 5th assessment report. I had been hoping that the 6th assessment report would be out, but it's not. But it is like imminent. I think it's any day now. So I can only use these, but they're representative of the 6th assessment report as well. And this slide shows how both, and I don't mean to for everyone who are heritage specialists, to separate natural and cultural heritage, because we know that that's a false dichotomy. But it's just been used here to simplify this slide to show you how these 7 sectoral chapters on terrestrial and inland water systems, freshwater resources, coastal systems, ocean systems, food security, urban areas, rural areas, all should include heritage on one level or another. And if you ask me, being a heritage specialist, one cannot separate heritage from any of these sectoral themes. A second paper published in Nature Climate Change last week, which I mentioned earlier, which dealt with how to decolonize climate change heritage research as a step towards a more equitable and just field of inquiry, included one way might be to ensure that heritage in all its forms should be included within countries' nationally determined contribution submissions to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. As I showed in the previous slide, given that heritage is integral to all 7 sectoral chapters of the IPCC Working Group to 2014 Assessment Report 5, and no doubt also to the upcoming Assessment Report 6, it seems that not to prioritize heritage is increasingly difficult to argue. Indeed, I was able to contribute to the heritage section of the indicative NDC for the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. And I'm honored to actually have been able to do that. And I wrote a little bit for the heritage section, but actually, as predicted, not only was there a standalone heritage section, but heritage was also integral to sections on settlements, infrastructure, health, and well-being. Looking forward, I think it will become increasingly important for climate change scholarship and policy to look to the disciplines of archaeology and heritage for insights on climate adaptation and to a just and sustainable future. I think we are just beginning, and I think that archaeology and heritage scholarship are about to have their time in the sun, as you can see from this slide, but hopefully not literally, given the focus of this talk. Yeah. So to wrap up, I want to thank the following people, and none of you are in particular order, but you've all made a direct contribution to the absolutely exciting research that I have been privileged to be a part in the last 2 years, extraordinarily under lockdown. And I couldn't have done it without you. I couldn't be a professor without you. And so I thank you all very much. And I know you're out there in the ether somewhere. So thank you.
Well, hello everyone. I'm Malcolm McLaughlin. I'm head of school. Very proud to have you as a professor in our school, Joe. That was what an astonishingly generous, characteristically generous way to conclude an inaugural lecture. A lecture I think does beautifully demonstrate the power of interdisciplinary research and collaboration, which is very much at the heart of your work here, and I think you've demonstrated that today. It was a fascinating talk, and took me and imaginatively transported me into places I've never really even thought of going or visiting or know anything about, and I can see immediately from the summary of your research there that there is so much at stake in what you're finding here, and that you're contributing to saving world heritage at a moment of great peril, as well as alerting the world to the coming unfolding crisis in our climate, and hopefully we will avert the worst effects of that and mitigate it. So thank you very much indeed, Joe. I'm really looking forward to seeing what questions we have. We have a wonderful audience here this evening, and also an audience watching over the internet on computer screens, and I always like to think as well, maybe on smartphones, on buses and so on. I was kind of amazed by this. I'm showing my age. But before we do open it up for questions, I was wondering if you could join me in another round of applause for our wonderful Professor Joe Clarke. I'm getting all emotional. Thank you. Really tremendous. So if we can detain you for a little bit longer, we have a good 10 minutes for questions available to us. And I know it takes some time for people on the other end of the digital interweb to type questions in. That'll be happening. But we have an opportunity here in the room if anyone would like to popped their hand. We have a question straight out the gate there. There's a member of the audience with a red scarf there, first of all. But I did spot there's another question there as well.
Thank you very much, Joe. And it's admirable how you included not just the buried record, which is what most archaeologists would look at, but also standing remains and natural heritage and intangible practices and rock art. So I think the 21 years here have actually rubbed off in a way. But my question was really, really broad. I think you've shown very well the challenges of interdisciplinary work. You've shown how archaeology is maybe getting more of a place at the table. And I wonder if we could open it up as well as climate change. There's a lot of interest currently in sort of models of less hierarchical societies and the ways in which the past was perhaps different to what it is now. The pandemic has led people to read a lot of this kind of stuff. And I wondered if, this is a really big question, but I wondered if you wanted to talk a bit about what archaeology can say about the social and human condition on the long time scale. That's it.
Wow.
Thanks, Anne. They didn't make you a professor for no reason, did they? Oh. So, you know, I think the thing about archaeology is that before we even begin to do what we do, we are interdisciplinary in a way that arguably other disciplines are less so. Not to say not, but are less so. And this, I think, gives us a really interesting perspective on such a range of knowledge that, you know, has to be broad just by the nature of our discipline. So it doesn't surprise me, I'm not necessarily going to comment on it, but it doesn't surprise me that there are not a lot of archaeologists out there probably working with the medical sector on, you know, how plagues may have impacted societies even in the recent past, you know, in historical situations, but also, you know, in deeper time. And it's not surprising that it's not surprising to me that archaeologists would also be working on fields like, you know, how something like plagues or pandemics might impact societal behavior. You know, what does it do to the psychology of society? So none of that surprises me. I can't comment on it because having said that archaeology needs to be multidisciplinary, I do tend to focus on my little bit of climate change. And it is an insy-tinsy bit of climate change. So, I mean, that would probably be my principal answer. I'm not sure if that actually answered your question, but you know, hats off to archaeologists for doing all this extraordinary interdisciplinary work that they do undertake.
Good answer. I have to say, I almost feel like you deserve another round of applause for that. A whopper of a question. I think there was a member of the audience just here, yes, with a question as well.
Hi, thank you so much. It was absolutely fascinating. I had a question about one of the case studies you talked about. Forgive me if I get the name wrong. Was it Jenny Geno?
Jenny Geno, yes. Geno.
And I work a lot around resilient communities and adaptation. And I wondered, because you talked about the kind of lessons learned for settlements now, and I wonder if you could just expand on that with an example or two to really, I guess, more tangibly explain what those lessons could be.
Well, so the work I did with the Tyndall Centre and with development studies used a couple of case studies. And the one, I think, in particular were the kind of peri-urban centres that were developing around Durban in South Africa. And my colleagues, and I don't really want to speak for them too much because they are the experts. And I think one point I'd kind of like to make, actually at the outset, is that what I have learned from the work that I have been doing is that I am not an expert on anyone else's field. And I'm not even close to understanding it. the more I think I know, the less I know. And that is, I mean, I know that's an age-old adage, but it is so true. And if anyone thinks that they can become, you know, an archaeologist, or anyone thinks they can become a climate scientist, unless they go through the process of learning how to become one, i.e. the full degree program, and then the PhD, it's not possible. So that is a really important thing that I have learned through this process, and I think it's one of the things that made the research on the African heritage sites at risk so successful, because no one tried to do the other person's job. Having said that, the people I worked with on Durban, I think they were starting to be really interested at the idea of one, greater mobility, bringing arable and market gardens into the city. So this concept of having, you know, your city and your surrounding satellite, you know, market towns, possibly, I mean, I don't know, because I'm not the one who's going to do that work, but possibly won't work into the future, because it requires so much energy for that model to happen. So we need to start thinking about other models of what, you know, sustainable settlement cities, and it may be that, you know, we have to not have cities of 4, 5, 6 million people, or it may be that we end up having, you know, clusters within cities of 6, 7, 8 million people that work in a kind of a scaled up Geno model. I'm not sure, but I think it's something to look at, you know, that there are other ways of being, you know, we're entering a period of energy crisis. We have to do something about our use of energy, and looking at how we run our cities is the first thing we should be doing. And we should be looking at everything, you know, not just cities around the world and see what they do best, and not just modeling what a resilient city might look like, but also looking at the past, using every resource at your disposal to, you know, try and think how we might go forward in a sustainable way.
Thank you for that question. There was another question, I'm afraid, sort of slightly dodging behind the pillar here, but there.
Thanks, Joe, for a typically thought-provoking presentation. What first piqued your interest in climate change, and what sort of, and how has that impacted the sort of program of research that you're now engaged in?
That's such a lovely question, Andrew. Thank you. I blame him. Point him out there, Nick Brooks. So years and years ago now, actually, in 2005, Nick approached me. He's a climate scientist, as many of you in the room know, and did his PhD in the Climate Research Unit here at UEA, specializing in dust, I gather. But he was working in the free zone of Western Sahara, or had been invited, had actually already started. And he approached me because he was not an archaeologist, he was a climate scientist, wanting to bring together archaeology and climate science. And I was fascinated by this, plus I also love working in deserts. We got involved in this project, and I have to say we've never looked back, really, have we? And we continue to write together, and we continue to research together. And so, in a way, Nick's taken me down that pathway, really. Whether I would have without meeting Nick, I don't know. Oh, you're in that list. You're up there. Yeah, that's it, really, Andrew, I think. I mean, probably I already had a proclivity to that kind of, you know. I did start a geology degree and did it for 2 years and then dropped out because I couldn't do the maths. And my colleagues on the Africa chapter, on the African heritage paper will know I can't do maths. And they'll be laughing at the moment.
I noticed we're hitting that point of the half past the hour, but we can squeeze an extra question, I'm sure, he says, looking at Hannah. And Right in the back. Oh, yes.
Simon.
We're going to ferry the microphone over there. Oh, you reckon? I don't have my glasses on, so I can't see.
The glass.
Thank you very much, Joe. Wonderful stuff. Two points, really. One is that do you think that archaeologists, with their specialization in understanding the threat to vulnerable and fragile resources left over from the past, are in a good position to understand the threat to humanity's future? And the second bit is you referenced Gordon Childe, and one of his famous books was called, wouldn't be called it today, but it's called Man Makes Himself. It would be Humankind Makes Itself, I should imagine. It was published in 2022. Do you feel that humanity can remake itself for the Anthropocene from your archaeological studies?
Oh, I don't know whether I should have given this lecture, actually. I am deeply concerned about where we are going. But I don't want to bring down the evening by, saying how deeply concerned I am. We as archaeologists look back at the past, and although we do see some good outcomes, we see a lot of not good outcomes. So that, for me, shows me that human beings are extraordinarily fallible and not very good at thinking past the very short term. And I have to say, our kind of Western model, I mean, I'm not bemoaning democracy here, but our short-term, voting in a government for 3 or 4 or 5 years, who have policies for 3 or 4 or 5 years, is just simply not going to work if we want to do anything, to stop the train we're on, I think. Having said that, I think that it's never a perfect analog, is it, with archaeology? So there's nothing you could say in the past maps in any way onto our future situation. But you do get a sense of the human condition and the way in which people kind of, what you see is the result, don't you? So we see the process, and archaeology or cultural change is a process, isn't it? And we see what happens as people go through that process as societies or as even quite small settlements, even some archaeologists would argue as individuals, although I find that a little bit more difficult to see in the archaeological record. Yeah, I don't know. I think one archaeologist once said that it's like looking through the glass darkly, and that I would agree with him.
It's a serious question about us. We're at a serious point. I would say a serious way to round off the talk. You're right, but it's work by yourself and colleagues that you're contributing. You give us a fighting chance, and that's the thing, isn't it? Because we have a difficult time, but your work is helping to give us a fighting chance to get through this period in human history. What an incredible thing! What incredible work.
I think there are colleagues in the room who are doing quite a lot more than me, but I'm looking at them. Sorry, but thank you anyway, Malcolm. That's very kind. There's a question.
We do have a question. A further. Do we have time for a further question? I always like to squeeze extra questions in. I think they might pull their hair out at the events. But yes, over there. We'll ferry the microphone over to you.
Thank you for your brilliant lecture.
Thank you.
I have a question now about communities in Africa who have not evolved beyond the stage of rural setting to towns, but they are models of the evolution of. Okay, now other societies have or communities have evolved to towns, but these communities, like the Sukkur cultural landscape, is a World Heritage Site. Now, for many centuries, it has survived through different stages of climate change. And there are other similar societies like that in different parts of West Africa. Do you think that they can be studied as models of how communities have stood the test of time, especially different climate changes?
I do.
And should they be studied with climate scientists like Nick here? So that, because, because I think that when they are studied, they can actually have some, because I hear people asking various questions about how the lessons that we can learn from societies like Jene. Now, there are living societies like this, like Jene, but they are not towns. They're still in the rural stage. So do you think that there are some lessons that we can learn from them?
Yeah, I do think so. So, yes, Geno, it was abandoned in, the early 2nd century AD, around 12 or 1300 AD. So obviously we're talking about a completely different period of time. We're talking about a different kind of society. We're talking about a really connected society, though, with huge kind of advantages through those connections with the outside world, with sub-Saharan African trade, etc. Jene, I only used one example because, like anywhere in the world, there are so many different models for ancient cities in Africa. You could then go and look at Garama in, central Libya, and Garama is a completely different model of a city. Possibly, you would say it looks a lot more like that kind of old world city. I think the point I wanted to make was that a Western concept of what a city is was formed through the process, actually, of old world archaeology, of the archaeologists who went out to the Middle East, to Iraq and places like that, and discovered all the big sites. Well, they didn't even have to go, they could go to Rome or whatever. And so they made this kind of false idea of what a city should be, and then put a whole number, 10, of caveats, of characteristics on it. And that was really naive, because we all know, and certainly archaeologists know, that everyone lives differently. By creating a concept of what a city is, then you almost lock it in place. It's like the concept of the Anthropocene, and don't get me started on that. I already have, actually. I hate the term. I know why it was brought into use, but suddenly what it does is privilege humans on a geological scale. And I just think that's fundamentally wrong. But it's there, it's out there, and there's nothing we can do now. We can't take it back. And that's what happened, I think, with this model, this idea of what a city looked like, without actually thinking cities can be a whole range of different things. And you are right, I do admit that, when you think of Geno, it is a smaller, more agricultural, today 50,000 people is not a lot of people. But maybe we should be thinking about structuring our urban systems. It's not just that 7.5 billion people live in cities, it's also that they live on the coast, not all of them. But we're looking at sea level rise, we're looking at more of the storms we've had this week. And somehow, if we're going to make communities resilient, we've got to change the model. I say that, but So I think that we should look back at different types of living in large urban communities, and see how they did it. And I think Geno's amazing. It's, here you have all of these people living together with no established hierarchy. I mean, how did you get together Two, there'll be archaeologists out there who may not have signed off yet, who'll be able to tell, who would say, I know how they did. But, you know, the thing is that they got together, mobilized themselves to you know, undertake all kinds of community works, and yet they're not hierarchically structured. And that on, you know, so that would just be one interesting thing to research, just simply that. You know, how might that work in a modern day society so that we don't have this continuing wealth gap happening, you know, across the world? So I don't know if I answered your question, yeah. But I do think that places like Geno should feed into wider discussions. I think that's it, yeah.
Thank you.
Hannah, we're on a bit of a roll. We have another question at the front. Do we have time to squeeze just one more in? Is that okay? All right, that's great. Yeah, we do apparently.
Oh, okay.
That'd be great. It's just right here on the front.
Hi, Hannah.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, sorry, we're certainly making you sing for your supper.
Yeah, where's the wine?
Oh, that's coming.
In a minute, Joe. I promise I'm not going to be.
It's all right, Joanna.
Well, absolutely stunning presentation as always. But my question was about the application of your research, for example. Do you have any idea whether in the future, if has anyone approached you about, oh, it's great, interesting, and amazing research, how can we actually put it into practice?
What, with like sea level rise and what we do?
Well, in terms of actually trying to, you know, adapt policies and adapt.
Yeah, I think it's just slowly happening. You know, there's stuff going on out there that I'm not at liberty to discuss in this lecture. So the secrets that are kind of underway, not for any secret reason, but you know, there is stuff going on, and I think there will be more work of this kind, not just by me, by other archaeologists who will already have access to Macaulay's models, and I'm sure already on top of it. You know, there will be, I think, a lot of this kind of work coming out, and there will be other archaeological teams who will be looking in detail. We just did heritage sites, but you know, I'm thinking of Iamina, I'm thinking of you know, the big Arcadia projects that are running at the moment. They have people who are, you know, can use Macaulay's models, have the ability to do that, and also have the really close relationships on the ground. So, for example, you know, if you work in Libya, and many of my colleagues do, one of the things I would think that they would do now is probably grab hold of Macaulay's model and look in more detail at all the sites that they already have mapped, but are not heritage sites, and see, you know, what the closer picture is going to look like. So.
Well, thank you ever so much, Joe. That was a wonderful Q&A session as well. So I hope if I could invite you to join me in another further round of applause for our wonderful professor.